the world of urban real estate development, it's often a lot cheaper to build up than it is to build out. Of course, the reason is obvious. Land in urban cores is super expensive. And so adding additional floors doesn't increase the cost of the land involved. But this math breaks down at a certain point, because as you build a taller and taller building, you increase the engineering challenges associated with it, and you have to account for certain things like taller buildings need better ability to move in earthquakes, or taller buildings are going to need more elevators, and so they take up more space. And so eventually, building super tall buildings becomes an economically questionable pursuit. So it's not really all that big a surprise that the world's tallest buildings aren't built purely for economic reasons. Rather, they are built for a splash. The Burj Khalifa, the current tallest building in the world, about 800 meters tall, was built in order to make a name for Dubai, in order to increase tourism to the city as a whole, not just to sell office space in the building itself. The current Jeddah Tower that's under construction is going to be apparently a kilometer tall for much the same reason. People want to make a name for themselves. Well, as it is today, so it was way, way back. Today we're concluding our look at stories from the primeval history, the stories between the fall of Adam and Eve and the call of Abraham. So today's story is on the Tower of Babel. It takes place in Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 to 9. It says, "Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, 'Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly.' They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, 'Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we can make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth.' But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, 'If, as one people speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so they will not understand each other.' So the Lord scattered them from there over the face of the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole earth, and from there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth." So just a quick note on the text, something that's not immediately obvious. Well, first, the word Babel and Babylon, which comes up much later in the biblical story, are the same word in the Hebrew. And the word for Babylon and Babel is Babel. And the Hebrew word for confuse is Balel. And so the similarity of these two words is intended as a wordplay that basically says those Babylonians are confused. Now, we may have a hard time understanding what it is about the Babylonian actions here that is so offensive to God that he has to judge them in this way. So let's shed some light on this. So today I'm going to do something that I basically never do, but it just kind of happened to work out that way. I'm going to do a 3-point alliterated sermon structure. Don't get used to it. So the first point here, the first reason that God does this to the Babylonians is because of their pride. God had instructed Noah and his descendants, upon leaving the ark, to spread out. In Genesis 9:1 it says, "God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, 'Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth.'" And so this city represents an attempt by the people to disobey God's explicit instructions. In fact, the reason that they give for building the city is that so they won't be spread out. So this is an act of defiance against God. It's also true that the Old Testament text has a generally negative view about cities. Cities tend to gather their strength and impose their will on other people. They act like a collective bully. And you can see this in instances where people come together. Sometimes people who might be well-meaning in life become part of something more malicious when they're put together. In Stratford, where I grew up when I was a teenager, there was an arcade that opened in the mall. The arcade's primary audience was teenage boys, and they were all away in the arcade. Things weren't so bad. But, of course, there was always a bunch standing outside having a smoke back when a lot more teenagers smoked. And when there was a large crowd of teenage boys outside, you wanted to give them a wide berth, because if you walked through a crowd of them, they could be really mean. They could be really disrespectful, even if the individuals involved wouldn't necessarily behave that way. The pack mentality sets in. And there's a sense that somehow this pack mentality sets in to cities as groups of people are drunken with power. Before modern nation states, empires often began as cities. We see this in the Roman Empire that began from the Roman city-state, or there was the Assyrian Empire that began from the city of Assur, or of course the Babylonians themselves begin from Babylon. And the reputation that the Babylonians seek is also a reputation that comes at a price for other people. In modern real estate development, if a developer says, I built a tower or something, that doesn't mean that they were the ones who stood the girders, or they pounded the rivets, or installed the glass, or the drywall, or did the plumbing, or the electrical. No, they're probably the one who raised financing, or maybe took care of permitting and organized the different subcontractors to do the actual work. Now, that's fine. In our economy, labor specialization allows us to be more efficient, and everybody gets paid. But in the ancient world, not so much. The people who are planning this for their own benefit aren't the ones who are going to do the hard work of actually building the tower. And in that time and in that economy, a lot of that work, or maybe all of it, is going to be done by slaves. And if you increase the amount of labor required by increasing your ambitions, chances are people need more slaves, and so they're going to press more people into slavery. And so these people are going to build a city, a reputation for themselves that is built on the backs of those who are powerless. And so they try to make themselves out to be God. But that divinity, so to speak, comes at the expense of other people. As followers of God, this should not be our way of operating in the world. After all, we are meant to follow the example of Jesus, who shows us a very different alternative. Paul, writing to the Philippians, says, Christ was truly God, but he did not try to remain equal with God. He gave up everything and became a slave when he became like one of us. Christ was humble. He obeyed God and even died on a cross. Then God gave Christ the highest place and honored his name above all others. So do we try to make a name for ourselves, or do we make a name for Jesus by imitating him? Which is our ambition? To cultivate accomplishments for ourselves, or rather to cultivate Christ-like character in ourselves? Christ-like character, of course, is expressed in humble service to other people in love. So the first problem was pride, and the second problem is presumption. The people are building something that archaeologists would refer to as a ziggurat. A ziggurat is sort of like an artificial mountain. It's a stepped pyramid with steps that go up to the top, and on the top is an area where people can meet with the divine. You've probably seen them all over the place. For example, some of the most famous ruins in Mexico are ziggurats. And the artwork that I put up at the beginning of the service is an AI-generated version of a ziggurat. And so ziggurats are places where humans can invade the heavens. In both Hebrew and Greek, the main biblical languages, sky and heaven are the same words. It's seen that the sky is the abode of God or the gods. And so a ziggurat is really about human efforts to come into God's space. Now, in the pagan ancient Near East, People's perception of the gods was that they were transactional and self-interested. So they didn't necessarily want to do something for you, but they could be induced to do things for you if you offered them something of value for themselves. And they wouldn't come to you to say, hey, is there anything you need? So you need to go to them, and that's what they're trying to do. But of course, the God that we read about in the Old Testament, he's not like that at all. He doesn't require us to come to him. Rather, he goes to us, but he does demand that he do so on his own terms. The temple and the tabernacle, they don't have any steps that take you up to some lofty expanse where the rich and the powerful can meet with God. Rather, it's all at ground level because God comes down. So this tower distorts people's view of God and his character. We don't go to him. He comes to us. He's eager to come to us. But remember, interaction is not possible by human effort. I can't demand an audience with God. God, you must come and you must justify yourself to me right now. Well, if I make that demand, God can just say no, and there's really nothing I can do about it. So God's presence is not something that I can demand, something that I can earn. Rather, it is a gift that God graciously gives to me. And so I need to receive it as a gracious gift, not something that I take. I sort of think about this and kind of like how I think about an experience that I recently had. A couple months back, Nora got sick with pneumonia, and I had to take her into the ER in the middle of the night. And we'd been there for several hours when they brought in breakfast and served one to me and one to Nora. And when we opened it up, it was, like toast and eggs and bacon. And the only thing that Nora found at all appealing at that moment was the bacon, so she scarfed down her own. Now, the bacon was the most appetizing part of the breakfast for me, too. I love me some bacon. But at the same time, I love my daughter and want to see her okay. And I don't think 2 strips of bacon is probably enough for her to eat after having been up that long. And so, as a loving father, I gave her my bacon. It's something I think that pretty much any loving parent would do. But at the same time, it would be a very different thing if she stuffed her own bacon in her maw and then, without saying a word or asking anything, just grabbed mine and started eating it too. I think I'd be a little less impressed. It's like, hey, I would have gladly given you that if you'd asked for it. Or I just do it because I see that you need that. But I feel a little different about it if you just take it. And I think that's part of what's going on here. God says, hey, receive what I give you as a gracious gift, but don't take what I would give you as if you deserve it for yourself. So heaven and earth come together, not according to our demands, but according to God's terms. In Jewish thought, the tabernacle and the temple were the place where heaven and earth intersected, where God's will was done perfectly. And of course, Christians understand that that is a signpost that pointed towards Jesus, who is both fully God and fully man. He is the one who bridges the gap, not human effort. And that's why John uses incarnational, or uses this sort of tabernacle language to talk about the incarnation. In John 1:14, he says, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling. Literally, he pitched his tabernacle among us. So the Babylonians try to take by force what God would freely give to them. And it's not just that they want to take what they would God would give them. It's also because who would get access to God? The top of that ziggurat is not something that will be open for every person. Rather, it would likely be open for only the powerful or the priestly. It would be a subset of the Babylonians who would get access to God. But when God comes down on his own terms, who does he spend time with? Well, Jesus spends a disproportionate amount of his time with the poor and the downcast and the excluded, the lepers and the prostitutes and the tax collectors. And so God isn't going to have his time monopolized for the rich and the powerful. We need to understand that God welcomes all into his presence. We sometimes can have the same problem as the Babylonians, trying to take from God what he would graciously offer to us. When we practice spiritual gifts, not because we are spiritual disciplines, not because we love God or want to cultivate a deeper love for him, but so that we can put God in our debt. God, I read my Bible every day this month, so you owe me. No, God's presence is a gift. We should receive it humbly and with thanks. So, pride and presumption is the reason why the Babylonians are wrong in building this tower. There's a third P that I want. That's not really a reason why they shouldn't build the tower, but just an observation about what happens when God does what he does. And that third P is politics. God made it so that the people couldn't understand each other. In Hebrew, literally, that they couldn't hear one another. Not being able to hear one another made unity impossible. And just as it was for them, so it is for us. When we don't hear one another, or when we refuse to listen to one another, unity is impossible. Now, that served God's purposes in this instance because this is a judgment on human arrogance. People had formed an alliance together in defiance of God's will to pursue their own agenda. But now God is doing something new in the world since Pentecost. God calls together a single group of people, not according to their defiance, but according to his will. And they're meant to take that message to the whole world. And so this curse that God has placed on people at Babel is undone in the day of Pentecost, when a group of people from many nations are called together because the Spirit allows them to communicate with one another, where before there would only be distrust. Now, language isn't the difficult issue that it used to be. Modern tools like ChatGPT and Google Translate make things pretty easy. It's not perfect, of course, but it helps us get the point across. Just this past summer, we had people who were attending this church who didn't speak English. And so rather than just having them sit there and stare during the sermon, I was able to take my sermon manuscript and just fire it through Google Translate. And I was able to give a copy in Persian to Alan and Massey, and I was able to make a copy in Turkish for Nugul. And so it's not that we can't cross those cultural lines anymore. The irony is that often it's our own people that we have the hardest time hearing and listening to. We live in a time of deep political division. The political divisions often run along the other cultural divisions, the urban-rural divide, or the white-collar, blue-collar divide. And oftentimes we are completely unwilling to hear the people that are on the other side of those disagreements. Our reflexive partisanship in our society means that our disagreements aren't just on what constitutes a good society and what policies might get us there, and suddenly it just becomes a matter of hating the other person and opposing whatever they stand for and being for whatever they oppose. But the church should model a different approach to politics, one where the disagreements are respectful and not reflexively partisan. Last spring, we did a Bible study here called The After Party that was about how Christians should engage in politics. And the study didn't go into how they think Christians should vote on particular issues at all. Nothing like that. Rather, it was talking about our posture towards others that we disagree with. It's saying that when we engage in politics, which really at its heart is meant to be the pursuit of justice, that we need to do so with kindness and humility. But unfortunately, oftentimes it's the church that is least inclined to engage in politics with kindness and humility. Now, it's not just how we engage in partisan politics that's affected by this. Rather, it's also about how we treat other believers. The church is meant to be a diverse community, and any diverse community is going to have a diverse set of perspectives. The church has a tendency to divide into different camps whose identities are determined by where we stand on particular issues. And so we other anybody who disagrees with us. And we really other the people that are supposed to be on our side but who don't toe the party line on everything. And so when we tie our identity to where we stand on issues that are of peripheral importance, we completely make it so that unity is impossible. And so Christians divide over things like complementarianism versus egalitarianism. Whether God has predefined gender roles or whether we can sort of work out roles according to what works for us, and whether women belong in positions of leadership. Or we have the charismatics and the secessionists, people who believe that God's Spirit still works in power today, and other people who believe that the more miraculous manifestations of the Spirit were something that happened only in the apostolic age. Or there's the Calvinists and the Arminianists who disagree about the relative importance of free will and God's sovereignty in salvation. Disagreement is healthy. It's certainly unavoidable. But the derision that we have towards those with whom we disagree is totally unhelpful. We're predisposed to this sort of theological partisanship, and so we don't hear each other. Oftentimes, we don't even make an effort to hear people. And so just as the Babylonians went their separate ways because they couldn't hear or understand each other, so do our churches. Now, we're not trying to spread out and subdue the earth. We are trying to be a unified people of God. And so when we don't foster unity, we are working at cross purposes with God. As John tells us about Jesus' prayer in John 17, Jesus says, I pray that all of them may be one, Father, just as you are in me and I am in you. May they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you've sent me. Jesus' credibility is established when we are one as he and the Father are one. And this can only happen, at the very least, if we listen to one another respectfully. It's not that certain people aren't wrong about certain issues. It's just that it's not our job to tell them how wrong they are about everything. And it's also sort of incumbent on us to remember that we don't necessarily have everything right ourselves. So maybe we feel very strongly that people need to follow a certain way, and in fact, we're just wrong. Division happened because the Babylonians were building a kingdom in defiance of God. And we also have to consider the possibility that we are building a kingdom in defiance of God. Is our life's ambition to see his kingdom come on earth? I know we always say that, but is it really? Or is our life's ambition to build a kingdom of our own, to make a name for ourselves, to accrue wealth and power? Do we cynically ally ourselves with people we know to be unChristlikeness so that we can achieve these goals, justifying that the ends justify the means, even if these aren't the ends that God tells us that we should point our life towards? Or do we follow Jesus' example of giving up wealth and power for the sake of other people? Whose purposes do we pursue? If we're pursuing our own, God will divide us, just as he divided the Babylonians, because he loves us and wants to stop us from building a grotesque imitation of his kingdom. But if we follow his purposes, he will knit us together so that as one people, the world can see him in us.